All right, so we've spent a lot of time talking about how to use a ventilator for EMS and what the different parameters are and how you might change things around and kind of change patient parameters with it. The question comes up, what do you do if you don't have a vent? Because all that stuff is still important. It's still really important that you don't exceed a really excessive tidal volume and that you maintain pressure and that you maintain the right rate and the right parameters otherwise. But what happens if you don't have a vent available? Maybe you are in a relatively rural area and you don't have either a lot of experience with it or you don't have a lot of means to obtain a vent, or maybe it's on the supervisor car and you can't get the supervisor to come and get you. How do you do the vent stuff when you don't have a vent? Because it's still super important. That vent level of care is still super important. How do you do that stuff when you don't have a vent available to you? That's the stuff I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about now. So when you don't have a vent available, that mostly means that you're probably going to have a bag, BVM, attached to the end of your device. Maybe that's a mask, maybe that's a King Airway, maybe it's an ET tube. How do we make that perform in the way that we would want it to in terms of right tidal volume, not going over pressure, not exceeding a rate, et cetera, et cetera? How do we do that? Well, it's important to kind of look at the mechanics of the vent itself. I want to mention that real quick. So you have your standard self-inflating bag, and this is again only self-inflating bags themselves, not the green thing like the Mapleson that you might sometimes see. This is the standard EMS self-inflating bag. So maybe you have a model that looks like this. Maybe you have a model that looks something like this. They all basically kind of function the same, but you got to talk about the anatomy of it real fast. So probably the easier way to go is with this standard one that you kind of see. What you've got is oxygen tubing that connects up to your oxygen source, whatever it is. That tubing flows in through a valve here and fills preferentially this bag on the back, this reservoir bag. When you put this to flowing oxygen, theoretically this is going to fill up. Now, you squeeze this bag, and when you release this bag, the bag by nature expands again, tries to retain its shape. When it does that, it draws air in preferentially through this reservoir bag in the back first. So air is preferentially drawn in here. If there's no air here or there's no flow, there's a valve back here that lets room air, 21% oxygen or wherever you're at, enter in through the bag itself. So preferentially, though, when you release, it's going to suck air in through that port in the back from the 100% oxygen reservoir back there. This is theoretically how you're going to get 100% oxygen with each of these bags. It doesn't end up being 100% oxygen, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, it goes into this chamber here, this bellows chamber here. When you squeeze that, air is forced out of this part and through this one-way valve, down through the mask or through the ET tube or through whatever the inlet port is into the patient. Patient does something with it, their lungs do something with it, and then the patient tries to expire. Air comes back out, hits this one-way valve, can't go back in through this bag, and so gets directed out the exhalation port of the bag. And somewhere along the way there's probably a pressure valve or something that you can attach to it, a little manometer, something like that. If you have a PEEP valve attached, it goes right on the end of that exhalation port, and the PEEP valve on these things is a spring-loaded valve. It's just a little spring in there with a piece of rubber that when it exceeds about 10 centimeters of water pressure, then the valve opens and lets air flow through. And it keeps it in there theoretically up to about 10 centimeters of water or whatever you have the PEEP valve set at. That's the basic anatomy of the bag and how it kind of works. So if you were to do this right now, this is not hooked up to oxygen, squeeze it, it's going to draw in air from the back and deliver 21% O2. If you hook this up to freely flowing oxygen at greater than your minute ventilation, then it will draw in theoretically 100% oxygen. And different designs, different types of bags all actually deliver different concentrations of oxygen, anywhere from about 50 to 60% up to about 90%, depending on the style of bag that you have. That's the basic anatomy of it. Worth mentioning real quick, if you have this style of bag, or if you're accustomed to this, same basic mechanics. The difference is you may wonder what this thing is on the back, that the oxygen tubing seems to like enter here and run through. This actually replaces the reservoir bag that was on that other thing. So what happens here is that oxygen comes down to yonder and then backfills through this tube here, and this is your actual oxygen reservoir. So the bag draws from this rather than from the jet of oxygen that's being delivered here. It draws from this filled up tube. So again, if you squeeze it right now, it's drawing in 100%, or sorry, it's drawing in room air from the back rather than drawing in oxygen. If you hook oxygen tubing of it up to it, the oxygen actually meets right here and then kind of, again, backfills through this reservoir tube. So that's the way that this style of bag works. Still works on the same principle in that you draw air or oxygen in from a reservoir, you deliver it through a one-way valve here, which in this case is the ductbill, and then when air tries to come back out, it'll be forced back out through the exhalation port, and in this case, the PEEP valve might fit right there on that thing. That's a brief overview of how the BVM is actually constructed and the basic mechanics of how it delivers air, and that'll be important in a couple of minutes here. What I do want to say real quick is that this is not an excuse, not having, what I do want to say real quick is that this is not an excuse to not use the vent. Just because you can use the bag effectively in the way that you should, not a good excuse to not use the ventilator, because the ventilator is still going to be safer and superior if you know how to use it in most cases. So we should be using the vent. We should not be using the vent just because you have a bag and you can do all this kind of stuff that I'm going to talk about. That's just really great use of the bag. The vent is still the better choice if you at all have that option. So you should use the vent whenever possible. In any case, if we are going to use the ventilator, or if we're not going to use the ventilator and we're just going to use the bag, there are some basic things that the patient should be positioned in. Number one, so having the patient up with head to bed elevated 30 degrees if at all possible, and then at the head in the sniffing position, especially if you're going to be using a mask, is a reasonable thing to do. And again, sniffing position is not dangling over the back of the stretcher. Sniffing position is head is translated forward with the chin kind of out like that. Like this gentleman is doing here, and that may require this ramp back behind it. But good patient positioning is super essential, especially when you're using the bag, if you don't have the patient intubated yet, but good practice for basically all the other situations as well. If you don't have the advanced airway available, then it is super important that you use a two-handed grip. And the anesthesiologists out there, when I commented on a thing at one point on Twitter, and the anesthesiologists were like, "Oh, we do this all the time." Okay. Great, good for you if you think you do, awesome. But I maintain that in the pre-hospital and emergency setting, that none of us are good enough to do a one-handed mask seal for any length of time. You might be able to get a couple of breaths in, but not a substantial amount for a long period of time, especially when the patient's covered in blood and vomit and sweat and stuff. Anesthesia patients are fasted and clean, and generally we can control most of that stuff about it. We are not in that situation. We don't have that luxury, so use a two-handed seal. Whatever you do, use a two-handed seal if you're going to use a mask, because you can't get a good seal otherwise. By the way, the two-handed seal, you can either use the CE sort of grip like this person's doing here and reaching behind and grabbing their jaw and lifting the jaw up. I prefer myself the kind of thenar eminences on it, and then I reach behind their jaw and lift forward again, lift the face up into the mask. Either of those is fine as long as you're doing the jaw thrust with it. And this is just an example of why a jaw thrust is super helpful. This is with a patient not jaw thrusted right now. You don't see much in the way of an airway. That's kind of what your epiglottis does, is protect things. But you do a jaw thrust, and all of a sudden the airway is open, and it's a lot easier to get air down into that trachea. So thrust, no thrust. Thrust, no thrust. So jaw thrust, super important. Two-handed grip, super important. Got to do that, especially if you're using the mask and you're going to do it effectively. If you have an advanced airway in place, obviously different story. All right, I talked before about all the different parameters that you may need to do effective and safe ventilation and oxygenation for your patient. We talked about tidal volume, rate, PEEP, FiO2, and how you change all those things and what those things change for the patient. It's important to know that all this stuff is still super important for the non-ventilator dependent patient. I.e. the patient that you don't have, the patient that you are doing positive pressure on, but you don't have a ventilator to use. All this stuff is still important to that person because these are safety parameters, and these are best practice parameters, and these are the things that help the patient get better. So you still got to do all this stuff. Just because you have a bag, that's not actually an excuse to not do the really important critical care stuff, because the patient doesn't care if you have a ventilator or not. The patient just knows, I need a safe tidal volume, I need a reasonable respiratory rate, I need a reasonable PEEP, and I need an appropriate FiO2 to avoid hypoxia and hyperoxia. So how do you accomplish that stuff when you don't have a mechanical ventilator to assist you? Talk about some of this stuff. Tidal volume real fast. Again, what's tidal volume? That's the amount of air that you squeeze into the patient, either through ventilator or through bag with each breath. Tidal volume is a speed limit. It's a total amount that we're going to set that we don't want to mess with afterwards, because it's the safety parameter. If you use too much tidal volume, you injure the patient lungs, and that number is 6 to 8 milliliters per kilogram ideal body weight. And again, why? Because even a short period of high tidal volume breaths can cause development of ARDS, like you see on this left-handed picture here. So it's important that we use appropriate tidal volumes for our patients and still maintain the proper minute ventilation, even if we don't have a mechanical ventilator. How do you do that? Well, the tidal volume on one of these guys you would think is pretty well set. What's the tidal volume on this bag? Well, it's however much you squeeze in. So on most of these bags, the actual capacity is, on these adult guys, somewhere between 1,500 and 1,700 milliliters, a liter and a half. If you remember, I said the ideal tidal volume for a person, 6 to 8 mLs per kilogram based on ideal body weight, which is somewhere between 450 and 500 for most Americans, or a third, less than a third of the volume of these bags. Now, you see people all the time out in the field or even in the emergency department or wherever, they squeeze the bag, okay, squeeze the bag, I'm going to do this, and you squeeze the bag each time. How much do you actually deliver when you squeeze the bag like that? If I take this in my big old meaty paw here and give it a good squeeze and basically squeeze out all I can, which most people do, then you get about 1,200 mLs of tidal volume each time. And this is based on actually putting it up to a volume meter and measuring how much goes in. So 1,200 milliliters of tidal volume is too much for almost everybody, unless they are, God, I couldn't even think of how tall this person would have to be. So 1,200 mLs, way too big, and is potentially injurious to the patient. What you can do about it is, rather than grab the center of this bag and put your hand through the loop and put two hands on it and squeeze as much as you can out of the thing, if you just change your grip, then you change the amount of air that you will deliver, gas that you will push into the patient with each breath. If you hold back towards the back, like you're holding the end of a football, and just give it a squeeze with a couple of fingers, then you end up getting a tidal volume. I get a tidal volume of somewhere around 500 mLs per each breath. And that's pretty reasonable for most people, good enough for government work anyway. If you were going to use this thing on the side because your hand is small or the bag's slippery or something like that, then you don't necessarily have to squeeze the entire thing every time. Remember, use a couple of fingers and just squeeze enough to get chest rise out, and that's probably about 500 mLs of tidal volume. Now, I've taken a bag and squeezed it into a mannequin that senses how much volume we're putting in it each time, enough to know about how much 500 mLs is for me, and it's about like that. I've just practiced with it. You can do the same thing if you have the ability to measure volume. So if you get that opportunity, really practice on it and get to know what that 450 to 500 ml tidal volume feels like in a regular bag. The other thing you can do is you don't have to use this giant adult-sized bag each time. They do make small adult-sized bags which have a total volume of about 700 mLs, or child-sized bags usually have a volume somewhere around 600 mLs. You can just use one of those, and then you can squeeze basically the entire thing, and you still won't really give the patient too much volume over 500 or something like that. So using a smaller bag is the other option, but if you do have these large bags, you certainly should change your grip and just squeeze the back of the thing, because you don't need the whole volume of air going into the patient on each time. That's tidal volume. How about the rate of ventilation? Rate's one of the other things we're going to set. If you remember, respiratory rate basically determines your end tidal CO2. If you have a fixed tidal volume, which we're going to try to fix the tidal volume, how fast should we be squeezing this person? Well, we want to get their end tidal CO2 ideally between 35 and 45, which in a reasonable tidal volume is going to be somewhere around a respiratory rate of 15 to 18 in most intubated patients. Patients with, you're just doing a face mask, may need a little bit higher tidal volume because of the dead space, but for the most part, 15 to 18 breaths a minute. How do you get 15 to 18 breaths a minute? It's really hard, because none of us know. That's a breath every 4 seconds or just a shade under 4 seconds. How much does that actually equate to? What does that look like? Well, it's tough for us to tell, and most of us don't have a good handle on that. So they do make things like timing lights, which you may have seen for bags, but these are designed to use for CPR. When you pull that tab, that light flashes and tells you when to squeeze the bag. The problem is that goes off every 6 seconds or so for a rate of about 10, which is going to be hypoventilating somebody who is not in cardiac arrest, generally speaking. How do you do that? Well, you can get a metronome that you can set to a different tempo. So in this case, it's 60 beats per minute. If we're going to squeeze every 4 seconds for a rate of 15, then we go beep, click, 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 beep, click, click, click. And this is a mechanical fancy one that's kind of expensive and looks cool. But you can buy these relatively cheap ones off of Amazon for like $9 a piece, and they'll work for what you're doing. They got a little clip on the back. Set that for a rate of, if you want to set it for 60 beats a minute and just squeeze every 4 seconds, or if you want to even set it for, 6 times a minute, then just squeeze whenever the bag or whenever the thing beeps at you. You can do a lot with this, but something that gives you consistent timing and an audio cue is super important for this, because none of us know realistically what 4 seconds feels like when you're doing this stuff and when you're actually dealing with a patient. So get your metronome and use that. How about pressure? The vent usually determines pressure for us and keeps us from overpressurizing because of the alarms and because of our settings and stuff. You don't have that on most bags, but what we do have is the availability of little manometers that you can stick on the end of the bag in a lot of cases. So it may go something like here on the side of it. Some of these come with the manometer already on it. It is worthwhile to get one of these things. So that you're not trying to deliver 60 centimeters of water to every patient that you're breathing. It is really hard. People say, oh yeah, I can tell when the bag's getting stiff. Well, you can probably tell between like no resistance and essentially no flow, but the gradation in there is probably not apparent to you when you're squeezing this bag. So get a manometer so that you're doing things right. And that will also let you monitor, say, PEEP at the end, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, speaking of PEEP, remember that PEEP and FiO2 together determine your SpO2. They're sort of tied at the hip. You change one, you change the other. The problem is that a lot of times a bag is handed to you, and you really think you have zero control over either, because there's no PEEP valve on the end of it, and your FiO2 is set at what you think is 100% because you've got this at flush rate and it's flowing as fast as you can, essentially 25 liters per minute or whatever you got it hooked up to, essentially on. So most of us think that, well, we don't have a lot of PEEP and I don't have the ability to change FiO2, so we're just going to go 100% all the time with zero PEEP. Not actually the case. Talking about PEEP itself first, what is PEEP? Again, positive end expiratory pressure. Basically, after a breath, your lungs get a little bit of pressure still stuck in them when you are using PEEP. If you don't use PEEP, then your lungs will recollapse each time. And you see the alveoli here will progressively open up more and more as they increase the PEEP. This is a PEEP of 10. He's going to get to 15 in a second. You'll see even more alveoli continue to stay open after each breath. And what does that do? That allows you to keep more lung segments open, not overpressurize things, and you get much better oxygenation by better use of your lungs. So PEEP is important. How do you do PEEP on one of these bags? Well, quite simply, you put a PEEP valve on the exhalation port of the bag. Remember how I said before, air is blown in through here, goes into the patient, swirls around and does whatever. When you release pressure here, then air will flow back up preferentially. It hits this valve that won't let it flow back into the reservoir bag and tries to go out the exhalation port. If you put something that adds resistance to the exhalation port, then whoosh, gas can't escape until it reaches a pressure of, in this case, it's dialed to 10. So 10 centimeters of water, and then the thing opens. It's literally just a spring with a piece of rubber on the end of it. The problem with PEEP in this way is that it's completely passive. So it relies on whatever pressure is left in the patient's lungs. So whatever pressure happens when I release here is the total amount of PEEP that the patient is going to get. On a ventilator, a lot of times, and on a lot of systems, the PEEP is maintained by maintaining a constant flow of air. if I'm using this and there's any leak at all or any change in the size of the patient's lungs or more segments open up or something like that, then the PEEP that I set here actually goes away because volume changes or the amount of air changes and the pressure is lost, and there's no way to replace that pressure. It just provides some resistance to PEEP going out, which is not terribly effective. It's better than nothing, but it's not terribly effective. How do you make really effective PEEP with just a PEEP valve? If you are just masking the patient, one way to do it is to actually add a nasal cannula. So what you see here is on the left, a patient that is getting oxygen via the bag. This is a cadaver, obviously, so this is collapsed lung here. They're getting oxygen through the bag at 25 liters per minute, and they have a nasal cannula on the patient also blowing at 25 liters per minute. So they're getting this constant stream of oxygen, but you notice the lung is still pretty collapsed down here. There's not really a lot that's opening up. If they add a PEEP valve to the end of it, they now have a flow of oxygen here to fill the bag. They have a flow of oxygen underneath the mask to provide a constant stream of oxygen, and they have a pressure regulator here in the PEEP valve so that the lungs actually expand a lot better, and then you get whatever, close to whatever you've set the PEEP for on here because you have that constant flow of oxygen. If you don't have a constant flow of oxygen, to think that you're actually getting really effective PEEP, like you're actually getting 10 centimeters of water for PEEP just with a PEEP valve, not really the case. Add oxygen to it, and you do get pretty effective PEEP, and it stays, 8 centimeters of water, something like that. If you're set at 10, much better, much more effective PEEP, and the lung comes up a lot better and stays up a lot better. So adding a nasal cannula under the mask, super important if you are using a mask with a patient you want to deliver effective PEEP, which you should. Now, if you have just an oxygen, oxygen via an ET tube or something like that, you won't be able to do this really effectively, but if you're just using the mask, you might get better PEEP with it. Worth noting, too, you probably need the oxygen, the nasal cannula that has the prongs on it. The capno cannula in this case doesn't really deliver oxygen through those prongs. It collects CO2 through those prongs, but the oxygen actually comes out through little holes kind of down here, and it just kind of creates a pillow, and theoretically it kind of works, but it's really not designed to do that. So use one of the traditional nasal cannulas for this application, and then you can actually put your end-tidal detector in between the mask and the bag itself. So put the end-tidal CO2 detector here, leave the capno cannula on the shelf, and just use a regular old nasal cannula for this one. Now, how about FiO2? That was PEEP. That's half of oxygenation. How do we determine FiO2 in these guys? And you might think, well, they're going to get 100% FiO2 because that's what the bag says. And that's true. If they get a high flow rate, 25 liters per minute, something like that, then theoretically the patient is going to get somewhere around 100% FiO2. It's, again, probably between 80 and 90, but you do get some increase in high FiO2 with this. Say that you have an intubated patient and we are just squeezing the bag because we don't have a ventilator, and the patient's sat as 100%. And we don't want them to stay at 100% because they've had a MI or bad TBI or something like that, and we don't want them hyperoxic. We want to get their sat at 98, and we want to leave it at 98. What might you do then? Well, you can decrease the amount of gas that is delivered. You can decrease the percent of oxygen that's delivered through this port by changing the flow rate. Go over to the oxygen regulator on the wall, and usually, again, we're going to put this up at 15 or 25 or up at the top, basically on as hard as it can. If we decrease the amount of oxygen that flows through there, then oxygen will instead be preferentially drawn through this tube in the back. And you would get an FiO2 of somewhere between 100% and 21%, depending on how much oxygen, pure oxygen, is actually flowing. If you did the numbers based on the math here, at 15 liters a minute, you get 100% oxygen. But at when you get to about 7.5, you should get a little bit less, and a little bit less as you kind of go down. These numbers don't line up 100%. It's more like at 10 liters per minute, you probably get 80%, and at 6 liters per minute, you probably get around 40%, something like that. But suffice to say, what you can do is just decrease the oxygen flow rate as long as you have a self-inflating bag, and you will draw in room air with each breath and decrease the FiO2. So if the patient doesn't need 100% oxygen, you don't have to deliver 100% oxygen to them. You can titrate it based on the oxygen regulator itself and on the flow. So that's how you would change FiO2, and that's how you might change PEEP as well. Real quick, let's hit on CPAP, because that's the other thing that some ventilator systems will do that you may not think you'll be able to do with a bag. Again, usually it's sort of a complex thing. It's this machine that delivers positive pressure, and we don't really know how it works, or if you've got a pneumatic-powered system, it looks something like this, and it looks really complicated. But when you break it down, what is it actually? Well, it is a source of oxygen, continuous flowing source of oxygen. This is just a neb that they've got on there as well, but continuous source of oxygen, a tight-fitting mask, and then a PEEP valve, which looks really similar to a continuous source of oxygen with a nasal cannula and a PEEP valve on the end of it, just like I kind of showed you before. So continuous flow of oxygen here, continuous flow of oxygen here, and PEEP valve on the front of it. And you may say, well, when you put this on the patient's face, and then they try to breathe out, and you're holding it on there, and you're going to just force air into them, and they're not going to be able to breathe out. Well, they're only not going to be able to breathe out until they reach the pressure that you've set with the PEEP valve. So if you set your PEEP valve to 10, and assuming that it's correctly calibrated, it will release when you reach a pressure of 10, just like a CPAP system would. If you're delivering a pressure of 10, if you're delivering a pressure of 8 or 5, or whatever it is that you're going to do, even having a bunch of flowing oxygen here will just preferentially flow out the top of this thing if you are using a PEEP valve on the end of it. If you don't have a PEEP valve on the end of it, then it's just 100% FiO2, and it just blows out through the top of that thing for the most part. Put a PEEP valve on it, and when the patient tries to exhale, it will maintain that CPAP, at least some degree of it. And again, it's not quite 10 if you set it to 10, but it's close enough for government work. It gives you something. One more time, all a CPAP system really is a continuous flow of oxygen with a pressure valve on the end of it and a way to keep the gas from escaping around the mask. And this setup basically does that exact same thing. It is a little bit hard to maintain, especially on a conscious person, probably a little bit uncomfortable, but it is something. And you increase the work of breathing just a little bit by putting this little duckbill mask in here. You can assist the patient if you want. But realistically, if oxygen is flowing through that nasal cannula at 25 liters a minute, filling up this space, that should be plenty of tidal volume for the patient to be able to maintain. But they should, if they overwhelm the amount of gas that's in this section here, it should actually be drawn out of the bag itself. So it's something you can try, is what I'm getting at, if you don't have another option. So to sum up, if you are using the bag and you are using a face mask, make sure you use a two-hand grip and have good patient positioning, because that is super important for safe ventilation. If we are going to use the CE grip, then make sure you're grabbing the face and lifting it up. Likewise, if you're using a thenar eminences, grab the jaw and lift up into the mask itself. For tidal volume, change the way that you hold the bag. You don't have to empty the whole bag each time. Just squeeze a little bit of it. Use 2 or 3 fingers, and you will get plenty of volume in, especially if the patient's intubated. You should get a metronome to help determine your rate. You should use a PEEP valve on each one, and if you are using a mask, if you want to deliver effective PEEP, then you should put a constant source of oxygen like a nasal cannula on underneath that mask, because otherwise the patient won't get it. If you are going to deliver really good PEEP and CPAP, you do need that nasal cannula at 25 liters per minute with a PEEP valve in place as well. So that's a way to use the bag, or a couple of ways to use the bag, if you don't have a ventilator available to you. Again, not an excuse to not use a ventilator, because a ventilator is generally better, but if you don't have one handy, or you don't have it available, or you can't figure out how to use it, then you should at least have excellent bagging technique using one of these guys. So, this is Walt Lovers. Thanks for listening.